So imagine that I'm on this Nike website, and let's just say for now that I can't read or speak English, but I'm fluent in Hindi. I can read it properly, so I want the content on this website to purely be in Hindi. Now, browsers do have a translate feature where they basically detect the language on the website and then try to do a decent job to translate to whatever language you want to select. So if I go here at the top, you'll see that I have a bunch of languages and I can select pretty much any language from this list to translate the content for this page into that language. So since I am fluent in Hindi, I want to translate this page into Hindi. Let's do that. And you'll see that it does translate the content, yes, but that's the problem. It translates the content. What if I don't want the exact translation? I want to invoke a similar emotion from the viewer who's on this website. It may not be the exact same text though that I want to use. Actually, it could be something very different and I want the freedom to configure that text. Let's say I have a brand specific phrase that I would not want to be translated as it is. There could be specific industry related terms for which I would want to configure the text for other locales or other languages. In case of certain languages like Arabic, you would want a right to left layout. You would also want better search engine rankings in specific regions, and browser translation doesn't help with SEO. The translation happens on the fly on this page. So when the indexing happens by web crawlers, this page would not be translated into Hindi. It's a feature that browser has provided and it only happens when I do it manually. It's not translated to Hindi by default, so it won't be indexed by crawlers. You also have different problems like showing time in someone's local zone based on their time zone, converting units again based on the region. There's just too many things you have to configure if you want to support your website for different regions. I didn't even come to the legal part yet, where it's mandatory for you in certain countries to support a specific language, or else you'll be fined for it. I'm not even sure whether it's just a fine. It could get much worse, to be honest. But yeah, I hope I've painted a clear picture on the benefits you'd get when your website supports different languages and why it's important in terms of accessibility. So for all these concerns, we have internationalization and localization strategies in place. People use these two terms interchangeably, but I'll explain to you what exactly is the difference between these two. Obviously, it's not the same, but they are kind of related to each other. So internationalization is the process of designing and preparing your application so that it can support multiple languages and regions. So for instance, instead of hard coding a piece of text in your app, which you know you want to translate for different languages, you'll use a placeholder like this, what you see on the screen. This actually comes from a third-party library, which is what we'll be looking at in a minute. But here you put this welcome placeholder and not the actual welcome message. You're not hard coding anything for a specific language, you're keeping it dynamic. This way, your app can switch between locales in real time and it's now partially internationalized. I'll come to why I say it's partially internationalized. Now, localization is the actual process of translating and customizing the application for a specific language or a region. So translating the welcome message, which can be populated inside the placeholder, comes under localization. These translations could also cover dates because the format that you see in the US might be different when compared to a European country like Germany. Even currency formats have to be localized because, again, the same issue. Every other country has a different currency, so it has to be displayed differently. The formatting has to be different. So when we build our application, we are essentially internationalizing it by adding dynamic behavior to support different locales and regions. We then create these translations for the said locales, which can then be used in our application dynamically at runtime. This process of translating and formatting content so that it works as expected in different regions is localization. So yeah, I've been talking a lot and we haven't really written a single line of code. Let's actually do that. Let's quickly set up a React app with Vite. Alright, so let's quickly create the project first. npm create, and I'll name the project i18n demo. Yes, it will be React and TypeScript. Let's go inside this project and let's run npm install. Now, along with the dependencies that we already have inside this project, I'll have to install i18 related dependencies. So The packages that we are going to use is i18 next, and along with that we'll use React's wrapper of i18 next. And we also have like a plugin to detect the language. So these three packages is what I'll need to run this particular tutorial. So I'll install that along with our original set of dependencies. That's done. Let me also install Tailwind because I want this application to look a little pretty. So let's do that. And I also need to initialize the Tailwind project. So yeah, our project is now completely set up. Let's open it in a different VS Code instance. And we have our project here. We zoom in a little bit. Now we'll need to update the Tailwind config for it to work. So I'll just paste the config from the documentation itself. And I also need to paste the directives inside the index.css file. So let's do that. Now let's start simple. We'll have a list of products and a toggle at the top to switch between languages. It's pretty straightforward. So inside our application, I'll create a components folder. And inside this components folder, let's first create a product card component. I'll name it product card.tsx. And this product card component is pretty straightforward, to be honest. It's a simple React functional component. I'm taking in a prop that is the product object. And if you look at the structure of the product object, it has an ID, a name, a price, and a date added string. And all I'm doing is displaying all of this content inside JSX. So it's just a typical dumb component in React where you take in a prop and you display content from that prop inside JSX. I've added some Tailwind styles as well so that it looks a little decent. So this is the product card component. Now let's also create the language switcher toggle that will switch between two languages. And in this case, it's going to be English and Spanish. So I'll create another component called language switcher.tsx. And this component again is pretty straightforward. I have these two buttons here. One is for English and the other one is for Spanish. When clicking on any one of these buttons, the state that keeps track of the language, so in this case, it's selected lang, this will keep track of the language that we have selected. This will simply update on clicking any one of these buttons. So I have the change language function here that I've created from line number 7 to line number 9. It's just going to set the selected language. It's a normal state setter. That's it. And I have a bunch of Tailwind styles on both of these buttons and even the container. So it's very straightforward. I have these two images here. So let me import those two images first. All right, I have the assets inside this folder. Now finally, inside the app.tsx file, we'll render the list of products and the language switcher. So inside app.tsx, I'll just update the content. And if you see here, we've imported both the components. We have the list of products, we have the language switcher, and we have a simple welcome text as a heading 1 tag. And we iterate through the products card. And for each product, we are simply rendering our product card component. So if I open this inside the browser, yeah, you see here that we have the application ready, but there are some styles off. So what I'll do is I'll quickly update the already existing styles inside the React application. So inside index.css, I don't need most of these. So I'll just get rid of pretty much all of them. And inside app.css, again, I don't need much. So yeah, now if I go back, ideally I should get my application. Yeah, this is fine. This is what I had wanted. Let's see if I can update this date inside the product card component. It looks a little ugly. So instead of stringifying it, what I'll do is use to locale date string. I guess this would make it a little bit more readable. Yeah, this is fine. So we have our application set up. Now switching between these two here does nothing inside our app. If I switch between English and Spanish, the content is pretty much the same. That's because we haven't really implemented internationalization in our application right now. In our app inside the product card, I want these static words, product name, price, and added on. I want all of these to be dynamic so that anytime I translate between English and Spanish, these words can be translated then and there. I don't want them to be hard-coded inside this app. So let's fix that. So at the end of the day, it's us who have to feed the translated text for these words. You can use external tools to build these translations, but you have to maintain it. So inside our project, we'll create a separate folder. I'll call it i18n, and this folder will have 3 files. The first 2 files will be the translation files for English and Spanish. So I'll create en.json and es.json. And inside these JSON files, I'll just copy these objects. So inside en.json, I'll copy this object, which has a bunch of keys, and for each key, I have some text. Similarly, inside the es.json file, I have the same keys. If you notice, I have the same set of keys, but the value for these keys is different, and it is essentially the translated version of whatever text I have inside en.json. So this is basically the same text, but it's translated to Spanish. So this is what we have inside i18n. And now the third file is like the config for internationalization. So I'll create index.ts, and inside here I'll just pass in some config that I've already built. So let's go through these config. We first have a couple of plugins. The first plugin here, language detector, as the name suggests, detects the user's current language. This right here is to pass the i18n object that we get from i18 next inside React i18 next. So to initialize React i18 next, I need this object, and that is what we are doing inside here. Only then we'll be able to call this init method. So inside this init method, we pass in a bunch of options. The first option is the actual resource for translation, which in this case comes from these 2 files. And we have set the fallback language to English. So for whatever reason, if this file gets corrupted and we have opened the website in Spain where the default locale is supposed to be Spanish, it's going to fall back to English. That is what this does. So once this is done, I'll go inside our product card component and I'll replace all of the static content with dynamic bits. So it's quite easy actually to replace all of this. I'll first get the use translation hook that's coming from React i18 next. I need this method called T, which I believe stands for translate. And this comes from use translation hook from React i18 next. But before actually going through this, let's go back to one of these translation files. So I'll go here. So if you notice, we have plain static translations like this welcome message and even the product name. But for the next 2, you'll see that we have this template little like syntax for price and date. Now this lets you pass dynamic values for translation along with the static bit. So in the case of price, you have this price, which is the static bit, this string right here. And at the same time, for the price, which is going to be dynamic. So in case of the products, if I go back to the browser, you'll see that the price is dynamic. It probably comes from an API. So this is not going to be static, but this text right here is static. So for that price, which is dynamic, you use these curly brackets. So basically these first 2 are regular translations. These 2 are interpolated translations. It's like placeholder for dynamic values. The reason why we are doing this is because currency formatting and date formatting is very crucial when it comes to localizing your app. We still have to configure a few things inside our config files to handle this formatting. It's not complete yet, but we're slowly getting there. So now coming back to the product card component, let's replace these static values. So if you notice here, we don't have the product name string. Instead, now we are using the T method that comes from use translation hook. And inside we pass in the key to which this text is being mapped. The product name automatically gets populated inside product card based on the locale. If the locale is set to English, then it's going to use this translation, product name. If it's set to Spanish, then it's going to use this. Similarly for price and date, we have again used the same method, but if you look at it, it's a little different. So the first parameter that we pass to it is the actual key. So in this case, it's price, and for date time, it's date added. And after that, you pass in an object that actually has the value for price and date. So if you take a look at this translation, you'll see that we have price and currency and date time. So to properly populate the values, we have to pass in price and date that comes from here and here. Inside the app.tsx file, we again have to replace this welcome text. So again, I'll use the same hook first. And for welcome, I'm going to replace it with the team method. Now for all of this to work, I will have to import the configuration that we had created inside this i18n folder. So I'll just import i18n and let's save this. Okay, so we're pretty much done. Now the only step that's left is to be able to switch between languages. So inside our language switcher, along with our local state, which is the selected lang, we'll use the change language method that's present on the i18n object. So let me first bring in that object, i18n. Let's use this over here. The reason why I'm doing this here directly is because I don't think we even need this state anymore. As far as I know, we also get the current language for this website from this i18n object. So wherever I've used selected lang in this app, I've used it here. So let me replace this with i18n.language and similarly i18n.language. So we don't even have to maintain our own state. We pretty much get everything from this object. So I can get rid of this. I don't have to set this anymore. And I don't even need this function. Let me get rid of this hook. And yeah, this should work as expected. We've used this function and we have replaced the state with the state that we get from this object. So I'll save this, and if I go back inside the browser, now you'll see that we are able to translate between these two locales. So if I want content to be in English, I can select this tab. If I want content to be in Spanish, I'll go with this tab. And if I reload this, so if I reload this application, you'll see that the language state is still maintained. That's because if I go inside the local storage, you'll see that the state is actually maintained by the library itself. You don't even have to do that. If I switch between these two states, it gets updated here. So anytime I reload the application, it's still going to maintain the language option or the locale option that I had selected previously. So yeah, that's one bonus that you get with this library. But if you notice, you don't really see any change in the currency or the date formats. It's both the same. Nothing is changing here. And I'm sure you know this, the dates in the US are in a different format, and in European countries, it's completely different. So in the US, it's month, day, and year. That is the order of the values. So you'll put in the month first, then the day, then the year. And in European countries, it's mostly day, month, and then year, as it should be everywhere else. I don't know why US has this weird format, but yeah, switching between these two locales doesn't do much. It's still keeping the date formats and the currency formats as it is. So I had mentioned earlier that we still have to add some additional config to handle formatting for these values. So let's do that. Inside index.ps, let's add an extra property inside this init options object. And this is going to handle the interpolation and formatting for both currency and date time formats. To do the actual formatting, we are internally using the native internationalization API in JavaScript. You can go through the MDN docs to see various config options to format currency, date time, and other items. But this should at least solve our problem. If I go back inside the browser, you'll see that now we have the formatted values for currencies and date. The date is now much more readable because earlier it would have created confusion with that day, month, day, year format. So now this is much better. It's more readable in that specific locale. In English, again, it's much more readable. And in the case of currency, you'll see that we have the dollar currency symbol, as well as for Spanish, we have the euro symbol. And by looking at this, you would also get this question that the values are still the same. In case of dollars, it's still 1000, and in case of euros, it's again 1000. So the internationalization API handles only formatting, and it won't handle the actual currency conversion. If you want to actually convert the amount from US dollars to euros, or any other currency for that matter, you need to fetch the exchange rates from an external API and then apply the conversion before formatting. So that you'll have to do yourself, so keep that in mind. Now, one final piece that I want to cover in this tutorial is pluralization. That's also a tricky part where you have to worry about the right wording for the number of items. Say for instance, in this example, I have 3 items. Now, if I only have one item, it would call it as item and not items, one item. The moment it goes to 0, it again has to be 0 items. This also has to be translated properly in Spanish. It's actually very straightforward to handle pluralization using i18 Next. So what I'll do is inside app.tsx, I'll make a few adjustments. So I'll first put the products list inside the use state so that I can update it inside the component. I want the re-render to happen inside this component. So I'll move this inside a use state. Let's call this initial products. I'll rename the products array here. And I'll add a function that's going to randomly delete any one of these products. So it's again a very simple JavaScript function. Let me add it inside this component. And finally, inside the JSX, I need to add a button that's going to actually run this delete function. So I'll add this button right after the h1 tag. So it has a bunch of Tailwind classes and it's going to run this delete random product function on click. So if I go back to the browser, so if you see here, we get the items count and we don't really have any items count key inside our translations file. So I'll have to add a few items again. Inside here, I'll copy these 2 items. And similarly for Spanish, I will also have similar set of translations. So what i18 Next would do here is look at the key and check its suffix. The suffix in this case is other. If the count that's passed to the items count is more than 1 or less than 1, it will use items count other. If it's just one item, then it will stick to items count. So in case of one item, your text should read, you have one item. Count will be 1, so you have one item. In case of items more than 1 or less than 1, it should read you have 0 items or 2 items, 3 items, whatever. So I'll save this and I'll go back to the browser. Now you see that by default, it says 3 articulos, which in English means 3 items. I'll go to English here just to demonstrate this. I'll delete one random item. Again, 2 items, which is perfectly fine. Now you'll see that it says 1 item. So pluralization is working here. The moment the count goes down to 1, the S is removed and that is valid English. If I delete this again, it will read as 0 items. So this is perfectly fine. In case of Spanish as well, if I do this, it's 3 articulos, 2 articulos, 1 articulo, and then 0 articulos. So pluralization works as expected. If you want more nuanced pluralization where you have multiple plural values, you can also do that just like you see here in this example. So you can see that singular, 2, few, many, all of these can also be handled using i18 Next. So yeah, that's enough for now. I just briefly wanted to cover the most common internationalization and localization scenarios that you'd come across in your application. Do go through the docs to get a more clearer picture on how things work and check out other scenarios where the library would come in handy. All the relevant links from this video are linked in the description. If you're new here, do subscribe to the channel for such similar content, and I'll see you in the next one.